It is my honor to introduce one of my advisors who has helped me look at the federal, navigating this at the federal level, and is a dear friend. And so please join me in welcoming Jim Tozzi. You can come up here. The stage is yours.
Nothing like being on time, right? Thank you very much. I really appreciate two things that you've done. One is to allow me to speak to this group, given my background. And second, for anyone that gets up for a 9 o'clock gig in the morning or 9:30 gig and see a performer, that is really appreciative, having been in the music business a little bit. I also want to make a statement because if you look at some of my background, you might not expect that I would be necessarily very supportive of the cannabis movement, because I was a person that oversaw regulations for quite a while. And normally when I was introduced, I was up to the Congress one time, and this senator called me up, and I was testifying, and he said, you know, the committee is very fortunate today. We have a very credentialed person, Mr. Jim Tozzi. Now, when a person starts a congressional hearing off with the term Tozzi instead of Tozzi, you know the day is not going to be good. And it wasn't. He went on to say that Mr. Tozzi's very credentialed background was great, but his background had a lot of blemishes in it. And so I said, well, during my opening statement, I said, well, you know, and sometimes a blemish or maybe a wart, a few warts, is a sign of attractiveness. And he looked at me and he said, Mr. Tozzi, if warts were a sign of attractiveness, you'd be another Brad Pitt. So with that little background, let me share some views. So I can keep on time and don't wander too much, I'll make a few notes. My introduction into the cannabis movement started around a decade ago. And we, in the center I'm in, wrote some esoteric act called the Data Quality Act. And around a decade ago, it was right after the act passed, that we got wind of a group that was going to invoke the Data Quality Act on medical cannabis. And I thought that was sort of interest, so I got out of DuPont Circle and wandered over to some building. I think it was a press club. And I was walking into this room or this building, and there was this young lady there scribbling at 5,000 miles a minute, writing some kind of stuff. And I looked down at her, and she looked at me, and her face turned completely ashen. She saw all the warts. And so I went into that meeting, and there was a discussion. There was a lot of the patients, the cannabis patients were there. And the thing that really struck me and stayed with me to this day was a school teacher that was there. Now, I'll never forget this school teacher. And she was just like the kind of school teachers you would envision of half a century ago. She was very dressed. She had a nice white blouse, and she had the little brooch in there. And I even looked at her shoes. She had the Dr. Scholl shoes on. And oh, because most of you don't know this, but anyway. And so she went on to state, she stated that, you know, all my life I've abided by the laws, but you know, I need medical cannabis, and my husband has to go to areas that we never frequent. He has to go to areas that we're afraid that something would be bodily injury to him. And that really resonated with me. That was my first introduction to cannabis, and it was a lasting impression. From that time on, I started to meet with Steph and ASA and the remainder of a lot of the cannabis community. And so we thought that the whole issue of whether medical cannabis has therapeutic properties was most subject to the requirements and the jurisdiction of the Data Quality Act. So our center initiated a really detailed analysis of it. And after some point in time, we announced, it's one thing to do the analysis. 10 years ago, it was another thing to announce your analysis, because it was not near as popular to be on the side of medical cannabis 10 years ago as it was now. Notwithstanding that, we publicized our results. And coming from our background of deregulators and aspects like that, it got a lot of attention. It got a lot of attention in HHS. And it did not go well with some of our colleagues. But we sort of accentuated that, because after that, Steph and I were being interviewed in front of the old executive office building, now the Eisenhower building adjacent to the White House. And this reporter came up and interviewed us, and he said, well, what do you think about Miss Sharon? I said, well, she's doing God's work. And that's a term of art to Christians. And I wasn't aware of that. And we got all kind of estimates share about results of that. So now, the last thing I did is Steph invited me out not too late after that for dinner, and my wife had come back from Amsterdam, and she bought me this beautiful stocking hat with an imprint of a cannabis plant. So it was winter, so I thought I could wear it. And I was advised by everyone at our table I had to take it off. So how far have we come that Jim Tozzi can now wear a cannabis hat and no one looks at me? And I think it's very easy for people to forget. I would have never imagined that I would be sitting here 10 years after those events, and 20 states and the District of Columbia has taken positive actions on the legality of that. I think you have made unbelievable accomplishments. I mean, that is so, that is so big, it's so comprehensive to me, it's very hard to, oh no, that's not my phone, is it? At my age, you get mixed up. So let me go on now. I'm going to give you a couple views, because I think this conference that you have today is really a juncture because of the events of the last year. And here you have leaders of the cannabis community here, and I think you really should look at some real important directions and choices that you have. Now, I'm going to give you my views, but as my father said, I had worked in OMB for a long time, the budget office, and he said, before I got in the regulatory business, I worked on the budget. And he said, you know, Jim, maybe you should get a new line of work. And I said, why is that, Dad? He said, the longer you stay, the more the deficit increases. So you have to take some of my advice in that light. You got to look at what experts are. They're sometimes right, sometimes wrong. But let me give you my views on a couple important things. And I did not discuss this with Steph, CRE, or anyone else. And the first thing I would ask you to look at, or at least think about in your movement today and decisions, is sort of a tier 1 and tier 2 type decision. And let me go what I think that a tier 1 decision that y'all might approach. And the question is, should and how medical cannabis become embedded into established institutional structures? Your term may be mainstream. Now, one fast route to do that is to be regulated. Now, I hate to make statements about being regulated, because that carries sometimes a pejorative feeling to a lot of people. But there's a lot of upsides to regulation. There's a lot of downsides to regulation. It all has to do with the timing. Now, you might wonder why a person who's billed as a dereg person would make such a recommendation, or at least a consideration. Well, the center I'm with is called the Center for Effective Regulations. It's not the Center for No Regulation. And I think history will show that without regulation, a capitalistic, the regulations are the governor for a capitalistic society. And if you don't have any regulation, it'll chew you up, whether you're in the right lane or the wrong lane. So I really think that there's some need, and I know there's a lot of people who don't like regulation, that you should take a hard look in endorsing some type of regulation for medical cannabis. So the question then, and as I said, I think the passage of any such legislation would give, in my mind, unparalleled legitimacy, not that you don't have it already. So now, there are a couple perks of regulation. You're going to get, at wherever it is, a cadre of civil servants looking at your product. And you're going to get publicity. You'll have appropriated funds to look at a lot of activities. You'll have oversight. Some of it will be positive, some of it will be negative. But you become part of the scene. So my Tier 1 recommendation is debate whether you want some type of regulation. Now let's go to the Tier 2 debate. Steph, I have 4 more minutes, 5 minutes? Okay. Let's go to the Tier 2 issue. The Tier 2 issue is who regulates and what's the type of regulation. Now, you're in a place called Washington, D.C., and we read the Constitution that we regulate everything, and if there's anything left, we'll give it to the states. Now, there's some people that read the Constitution a little different, and some that don't, okay? But I really think that you ought to take a look at starting from the ground up with the states. These 20 states have looked at this, they have voted on it, they have experts in it, and they know their subjects. So I think you ought to look, if you are going to endorse, regulation, that you look at it in a way at the state level. Now you may ask, well, how and what would be the role of the federal government in that type of thing? And there is precedent for that. I don't want to go into all the details, but I have a very website devoted to regulations, and not too long ago some musicians from New Orleans were there, and they said, what do you do, Jim? And I had them look at my website, and they said it's the most boring site we've ever seen in our life. And so I don't suggest that you necessarily look at that in detail, but there is a precedent, and there are a lot of precedent, and it's a thing in the insurance industry. It is an act passed, I don't know, in the 40s, McCarran-Ferguson, which it said, the regulation of insurance by states is in the federal interest. And so I think there is precedent that you could begin a national effort with appropriate legislation to vest the authority for the regulation of cannabis in the states. And they've done it in the insurance industry with a federal statute, and I think there's precedent. And then, now you're going to have a few people say, well, yeah, but what happens if different states have different licensing agreements and different conditions for different standards, and whether the purity or the composition is different? We really need a strong federal statute. Well, first of all, I used to work for a director of OB called Burt Lentz. He just passed, and he says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The first thing is, let the states work this out a while. And if these issues become so big, then you could look at some type of federal intervention. But let me remind you that a federal intervention doesn't mean a federal dominant statute, because in the terms of the insurance industry, when we had a corrective mechanism, now I'm not supporting the totality of this bill, it's called the Graham-Leach-Bliley Financial Modernization Act. That had a lot of stuff in it I don't agree with, which is like getting rid of Glass-Steagall that I think contributed to this financial mess we had. But a provision in there was named at the insurance industry. And that provisions of that is said, it sets out certain minimum standards that insurance laws and regulations should meet to make them consistent among the states. And there was some federal intervention there, but it was limited. So where I think on the second tier that you should have is that if you go past Tier 1 and say that you're going to have some regulation, then I think you should look at Tier 2. And you have the choice between the federal and the state. There's probably some might like a more immediate, strong federal intervention. I think the states would be fine. And then, after you do that, I want to leave you with the idea, the way to really put it in play in D.C. is for y'all to draft up some type of legislation and put it on the table. So you're not in a defensive mechanism. You're proud of what you have. You made your decision. You want it to be looked at. And it's a transaction. It has a life of its own when you write some pieces of paper. I know that because they tried to indict me for stuff I didn't own me for 12 years after I left. So I think a transaction with a piece of proposed legislation that puts it in the states, says that you're going to accept regulation, would be a big step forward. And I'm the end of my gig time, so thank you very much.